Hi everyone, Loftus here with another episode of Game Dev Diaries. Today I thought I'd show off another game I've published over on itch.io and have a little talk about the process involved, particularly the benefits that relate to imposing time limits on your projects. So a few months ago I was involved in an interview process for a game developer role. The process involved 3 stages, with stage 1 being a regular interview type discussion, stage 2 being a project, and the final stage being a live technical assessment. The project from stage 2 was to create the game Asteroids in Unity. I was working full time when entering the process and as such had to work around my work schedule in order to complete the project. The deadline I was given for this project was under a week, and so in essence I had 5 evenings to complete the game before submission. Up until this point I had never created anything using Unity in that sort of time frame. I had gone through some tutorials and made a few games, but only one that was of a similar complexity to Asteroids, and that took me 3 weeks to make. I've always had a determination when it comes to job interviews that although I can't do anything to determine whether or not I'm chosen for the role, and I can't alter what might come up as part of any live technical assessments, as far as practical projects go, it's all down to me and how hard I work. I never want to fail at that hurdle, as I believe the only reason I would do so is from a lack of commitment to complete the task provided to me. It was a bit daunting to be given such a short deadline to complete the project, but once I got started and devoted my spare time to truly focused work, it was incredible how quickly the game took shape and results started to form. The end result, after 5 evenings of development time, was a game that I found fun to play, closely replicating the gameplay of the original arcade classic, while including a truly satisfying feel. I was fortunate that the one game I had made previously, which rivaled the complexity of Asteroids from a development standpoint, actually shared a lot of characteristics. Both were top-down shooters set in space, meaning they had a single object to control, scrolling backgrounds, Starfield-type simulations and moving enemies. While these similarities existed, Asteroids possessed some differences which made it an interesting challenge and gave me some new things to learn. Laser Defender was a 2D shooter, and while my version of Asteroids has the appearance of a 2D game, it is in fact created in 3D. This meant it had to be approached slightly differently and use 3D objects rather than sprites. Another major difference was the ability for objects to leave the screen in any direction and wrap around to the other side. I originally had no idea how to do this, but a handy online tutorial showed a technique of creating colliders on the edges that modify the X and Y values of an object when they come into contact. This was a great thing to learn, as when first looking at the project it was something I had no idea how I was going to approach. There were some other interesting aspects of the project, such as making asteroids split when taking damage and randomising movement. In Laser Defender, enemies move along various predetermined paths, and so setting up movements for objects to be randomised took a bit of a different implementation. Within the Asteroids game, the player's ship is destroyed the second it comes into contact with anything, and so lives were a necessity. The game is quite easy to scale, as simply adding an additional asteroid for each new level raises complexity for the player, with less of the screen being safe and more precision required for both movement and shooting. I implemented a UFO type enemy to spawn at set intervals during gameplay, which attempts to shoot the player and provides bonus points when destroyed. When first implementing this, the UFO enemy was far too difficult to avoid, and so I had to add some randomisation to its shooting. The shooting for the UFO targets the player, but an offset is added so that some shots will be more or less accurate than others. On a basic level, I was just happy to get all these features implemented into the game in such a short space of time, and it really made me realise that I was capable of more than I initially thought. Realistically, if I was given more time to complete the project, I would have used that time. If the deadline was in fact 2 weeks rather than 5 days, I would have used those 2 weeks, and I don't believe my project would have been any better as a result. I would have just worked slower, putting off harder tasks by talking myself into believing that they'd be more of a blocker for me than they actually were. It was actually the tight, strict deadline that enabled me to focus on the core task at hand, which was to get an enjoyable version of Asteroids completed. In corporate working environments, overly strict deadlines can be very detrimental to developers, but I feel this is often due more to a lack of understanding from others of what is required, and also the existence of rigid requirements for what needs to be delivered. If given a looser goal, such as making a fun game based around a certain topic, the results of a short deadline can be fantastic, as evidenced by many successful game jams featuring tons of created games. When the rigidness is in the deadline and not with the product, it actually allows you to draw on more of your skills and knowledge, as you can make informed decisions on what features are more or less important within your game. While working on Asteroids, I had a few things that I worked on but ended up cutting out due to time restraints. One of these was an original intention to have a set of space-themed music tracks, which randomly shuffle each time a level is completed. When looking to implement it, I ended up with extremely bad loading times, and it was something that I felt would be very jarring to the player, especially in a game that is otherwise rather simplistic. What I was potentially doing wrong to not be able to achieve that goal isn't really relevant here, but the main takeaway for me is that once I struggled for a short while, I had to make a decision as to whether to carry on with a feature or replace it with something else. Ultimately, I decided for the sake of a small game like Asteroids, a selection of shuffled music tracks was not a vital thing to have, and so I replaced it with my favourite track of the bunch, which now plays all the time during the game. This resolved my loading issue and more importantly allowed me to continue on with the rest of the game. A similar thing happened when I tried to replace the models for the player ship and the asteroids, looking to use much more advanced models and textures. The requirements of the project explicitly stated that the visuals would not be rated as part of the assessment, and yet I still thought it would be more eye-grabbing if they stood out more. I encountered problems that were similar to the music selection, and so after trying and failing to make the changes for a short while, I decided that it wasn't important and moved on to other tasks. In both of these examples, the key aspect is that if I didn't have that deadline imposed, I would have continued to try to make those two features work. I was getting more and more bogged down and could have easily gotten derailed before finishing the project, which is a problem I think a lot of starting game developers have. I often find myself striving for perfection, but that desire to produce something perfect can actually stop the game being completed at all. There is a saying that I like, which is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, and I try to apply it both on my own projects and when in a work environment. Get a working version that does the job and worry about perfecting it afterwards, if time permits. Completing the project was a massive eye-opener for me, and in recent weeks I've applied more strict deadlines to my own work and tasks. It's having great results, and I feel you actually learn more from completing an entire game development cycle than you do from resolving one particular issue over the course of a longer time frame. I'm really looking forward to the idea of entering a game jam myself and imposing those sort of strict limits on my work again, but with more creative freedom. If you're someone working in a development environment and you find yourself getting bogged down, I really do recommend just setting yourself a strict deadline to get a working version out the door and see how you get on. If you read articles for beginner game developers, I think the biggest piece of advice is usually just finish a game. After doing that a few times, I couldn't agree more. Thanks for watching this episode of Game Dev Diaries. See you all next time.